Hello everybody. As you can see, the sun is out again today, so I am glowing because obviously I'm just so pale that the sun reflects off me like a sheet of aluminum or aluminium, as we say over here. There's a lot going on here today. There's some builders here doing some work, so I may have to rush off at some point to do something. God, it is so bright. I'll sit back here. But I thought I'd squeeze a few chapters in for as long as I can manage, and we'll see how long we get. Cal, Brick and Daisy, who have all been victims of the Fury where everyone's tried to attack them, have now safely arrived in Fursville, this abandoned theme park where they're trying to figure out what's going on. This weird corpse that keeps breathing in air, inhaling air even though it's not going anywhere, is in London, and they've just brought in a priest to see if they can figure out what this thing is, because scientists and doctors can't. Yeah, we are now about to start Saturday. I think this whole thing started on the 3rd, Wednesday, didn't it? That's right, Wednesday, when Benny died. Feels like a long time ago now. It's Saturday. So, here we go. Are you sitting comfortably? I hope not, because this is going to be an uncomfortable ride. Saturday. The fiend in his own shape is less hideous than when he rages in the breast of men. Breast. Nathaniel Hawthorne. Young Goodman Brown. Rilke. So this is a new character we're about to meet. I'm sorry, I'm glowing so much. So weird. I look like a zombie. Okay, enough of that. Farlin, Lincolnshire, 12:23 a.m. We shouldn't be doing this. Rilke Bastian ignored her brother the way she had learned to do through years of practice. He trotted along by her side as if he were a dog, not her 15-year-old twin, his sad little face turned up to her with those puppy-moist eyes. If Schiller had a tail, it would be permanently fixed between his legs. Rilke, please, Mummy will be angry. Their mother wouldn't even know. She was cocooned in the same musty tea-stained sheets she spent half her life in. She spent the other half in the old-fashioned wooden bath chair that sat wheel-locked beside the huge windows in her bedroom suite, her eyes watching over the estate, but her mind rotted, unthinking. Please, Rilke, I don't want to go. His canine whine was a knife point in her ears, making the headache she'd had for at least 2 days now infinitely worse. She stopped, spinning around and grabbing Schiller by the collar. Looking into his face was so like looking at her own reflection, and yet utterly different. She could see the same high cheekbones, the same sharp green eyes, the same narrow nose, and yet it was as though she was staring into a trick mirror, one of the ones that distorted your image, making her chin too weak, her jowls too loose, her eyes too watery. She glared at Schiller until he looked away, as he always did. Only then did she release him. Go on then, she said, as he brushed his hands down his polo shirt, trying to get the creases out. Go home. Schiller peered down the street where the vast bulk of St. Peter's Church sat like a mountain in the dark. A mile or so past that lay home, the crumbling manor house entombed in the shadows of its endless grounds. Go on, she snapped. What are you waiting for? If you're going back, then go. I'm finding this party with or without you. But I don't feel too good, Schiller replied, rubbing his left temple. His eyes darted up, meeting hers for a fraction of a second. The truth was that she wasn't feeling too good either. Her head was pounding, but she ignored the throb, glaring at her brother until his hand dropped in submission. Okay, but I don't want to stay all night. Please, Rilke? Good boy, she thought. Good dog. She patted him on the head hard enough to make him flinch. Then she turned and carried on down the street. She'd heard about the party from a cleaner called Millie who worked part-time at the estate. Not that Millie had told her face to face. None of the staff dared talk to Rilke. She'd overheard the girl chatting to one of her friends when they were dusting the library. An illegal rave, she'd called it, and they'd giggled at the word illegal. It'll be cool, just music and stuff. Come along, it's not far out of town. You know the Logan farm, up by the coast. Not all night, though, Schiller said to her back. Please. All night, little brother, she said. She always called him that, even though he was technically a few minutes older. Till the birds start singing. Sorry about the noise. Farlan wasn't a big town. Some people didn't even call it a town at all, more like a village with an ego. It had grown up around their own house centuries ago, back when the Bastian family was rich and influential. Over the last couple of generations, the estate had crumbled under its own weight, the huge house disintegrating, rats gnawing at its foundations and pigeon droppings eating through its rafters. And the town seemed to be under the same curse. Good riddance to it, Rilke thought, as they reached the end of the high street and the boarded-up shops that sat there. The line of lights ended, a pool of bottomless black beyond, looking like the edge of the world. The stars were out, the moon too, but the cool silver glow they emitted was reluctant. A pang of something nestled uncomfortably in her stomach. She slowed, opening her arm and letting Schiller slide his own through the loop. He hugged it tight, and she could feel his gratitude ebbing off him in great golden waves. "I love you, little brother," she said. "You know I won't let anything happen to you." "I know," he whispered, as they stepped out of the light. Rilke slid the torch from her jacket pocket, flicking on the beam and carving a channel through the night like Moses with the Red Sea. She pulled Schiller closer, picking up the pace and practically dragging him along by her side. "Come on," she said. "It's not far." The music hit her at the same time as the stench of the ocean. She hated that smell. What did they say? That in Britain you were never more than 70 miles from the sea, and every year it seemed to creep in a little closer, eroding the beach and the cliffs, rotting the land away a few metres at a time. It was the vast weight of it that scared her, not just its width, spanning the gulf between continents, but its unthinkable depth. There was just so much of it, and if one day it decided to swell, to spill its lightless guts onto the land, it could wipe the world clean without a second thought. A frightening thought, if not necessarily a bad one. There wasn't much in this world that made Rilke smile. She breathed through her mouth, focusing on the glow ahead. Spotlights rose from a stubbled field maybe half a mile away, throwing light right back at the stars and the huge grinning face of the moon. The music was nothing more than a pulse that she could feel in her feet, as if the very ground were alive. The truth was she hated this kind of party. The people you got there, all high on something or drunk off their faces, all stupid, the same way most people were stupid. But it had to be better than another night of unrelenting boredom at home. Rilke had never been a big sleeper. She shone her torch on the short, grassy bank, then stumbled up it, Schiller's arm still limpet tight around hers. It was tough going on the uneven ground, but the earth was hard, and she kept her pace steady, sticking to the same ploughed furrow. The heartbeat grew more powerful the closer they got, popping in her ears, brushing against her skin. It found an echo in the pain between her temples. Thump, 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 like something was stuck inside her skull and trying to beat its way out. She picked up her pace, the rave pulling itself out of the distance like a cathedral of light. They were halfway across the field when Schiller stopped, planting his feet into the dry earth like an anchor. She turned, shining the beam into his face. "I don't want to go," he moaned, squinting in the harsh light. "I'm scared." "You're such a baby, Schill," she replied, wrenching him forward. He dug in, fighting. "Something bad is going to happen," he went on. "Don't be stupid." And yet even as she said the words, she felt something inside her, something in her gut scream out, "He's right. He's right. He's right." A wordless, instinctive jolt of adrenaline. The rave was close enough for her to see the ring of vans and cars that circled the party like wagons, and past them the heaving mass of flesh that seemed to breathe in and out with that bone-shaking heartbeat. Rilke swallowed, suddenly cold. She almost retreated right there, ready to lead the way back across the field towards home, but once again that stubborn streak stopped her in her tracks, made her bury that instinctive warning. The Bastian family had always been driven by its women. They were the ones to lead. She clenched her arm, trapping Schiller's tight and pulling him across the field. He needs a leash, she thought. They walked for another minute or so, the crowd ahead coalescing into individuals, guys and girls in their teens and 20s, pretty much all wearing glow sticks. Most were inside the ring of vehicles, but others were loitering in the shadows around the party, talking or kissing or lost in their own private, drug-induced dances. There was nothing to be scared of here. She'd stay for an hour or so just to see what it was like, just to have had the experience. Then they'd go. She'd pretend to be leaving for Schiller's sake. That way he would owe her. He was resisting again. Rilke looked over her shoulder, not slowing. He said something, his words lost in the deafening bass thump that seemed to rise from the earth. What? She mouthed, shrugging her shoulders, waiting for him to start moaning again. But he wasn't. My head! He yelled, leaning in close. It doesn't hurt anymore. She was about to reply when she realised that the ache in her own brain had gone, so swiftly and so suddenly that she hadn't even noticed. She put a hand against the side of Schiller's head, stroking his temple with her thumb. See, little brother, she shouted, smiling. What did I tell you? Everything is fine. He couldn't have heard what she said over the noise, but he smiled back, the reflected spotlights making his eyes twinkle. It didn't last. She knew what he was looking at before she could even turn around, like she'd seen it with her own eyes. Two people, a man and a teenage girl, stumbling towards them. And there was more, a flash of something else, something that smelled of rot. A girl and two boys asleep in an old restaurant, someone else walking through a forest, someone else driving a car, then a dozen more, 24 maybe. The images were so strong that she was gripped by vertigo, as though she'd been wrenched out of her own body and thrown into a lightning-fast orbit. Schiller called out her name and she spun around. The man and the girl were sprinting towards her, fast, uttering pig grunts as they gained ground. There were others too, the kids that had been loitering outside the party, charging across the field. They all had the same expression, silhouetted against the lights, but unmistakable. They were furious. These people meant to kill them both, Rilke understood. The knowledge absolute and unquestionable. They meant to trample them into the field, to make mud of them. She gave Schiller a shove, yelling at him, Run! Sorry, just checking my phone. See if anyone needs me. Nobody does. Nobody ever needs me. Brick, Fursville, 12:34 a.m. He swam up from an ocean of darkness, breaching it like a swimmer who's gone too deep, expecting to feel warmth and daylight on his face, but instead rising into an endless, heatless night. He tried to take a breath, couldn't remember how, his lungs screaming at him. He could see the new kid, Cal, right there, giving off his own weird light, like some deep-sea jellyfish. The boy was struggling in the torrent of darkness, his eyes bulging, his mouth gasping like a fish, and behind him, visible over his shoulder, a tiny form that could only be Daisy, her twig-thin limbs clawing at the water, trying to reach the surface. He reached out, noticing that his own skin seemed to be glowing as though he was radioactive. He stretched, trying to grab hold of Cal, willing the kid to grab hold of the girl, all of them kicking upwards. Brick woke, his screams more like barks as he coughed up darkness. He pushed himself to his feet, his chair toppling over behind him. There was still no light, but he could feel the ground under him, could feel the pain in his cheek where he'd been sleeping on his laptop. There was something else too, a ringing in his ears that was also profoundly silent, like inverted cathedral bells, whose peals were each a gaping absence inside his head. Daisy cried out, her voice pinched by fear. Brick screwed his eyes shut, even though there was no light, trying to remember where she was. It's okay, he called out, edging around the table, feeling for the matches. Don't worry, we're here. She began to cry even harder, and he heard a thump as she rolled off the chaise longue. Daisy, don't move, you'll hurt yourself, just hang on. He found the candle, burned down to the stick, and beside it, bingo, a box of matches. He carefully pulled one out, striking on the box, the tiny flame filling the huge restaurant with soft light. Daisy stood by the sofa, her arms out, her sobs muted as she studied the burning match. Here, said another voice, and Brick turned to see Cal walking over from the far side of the room. He held a candle out, and Brick lit it, placing it on the table. Daisy saw Cal and came running over, hugging him tight, her eyes still full of sleep. You okay, Cal asked her. You have a bad dream? We were drowning, she said into his t-shirt. You were there, and the other boy too. Brick, reminded Brick. Cal looked at him, and when their eyes met, Brick realised that the boy had looked inside. That the boy had been locked inside the exact same nightmare. Not only that, but he knew that if he'd waved in his dream, the others would have seen it. That ringing in his ears seemed to grow louder and yet infinitely quieter, and he worked his jaw to try and unblock his ears. It was a second or two before he noticed that Cal was doing the same thing. You hear that too? He asked. Bells, Cal replied. Daisy pulled her head from his chest and jammed a finger in her ear. They're too loud, she said, but not loud. I can't really hear them. I don't like it. "I've had this before," Cal said to Brick, his hand gently smoothing back Daisy's ruffled hair. "My head was, I don't know, like full of sound, but empty at the same time. It led me to Daisy." And just like that, Brick knew exactly what he was hearing. They all did. A moment of understanding that passed between them as easily as the reflection of the candlelight in their eyes. "It's one of us," said Brick. Cal nodded, saying, "And they need our help." Rilke, Farland, 12:37 a.m. The first of the crowd, the man, was nearly on them. Rilke bent down, scrabbling on the field until her hand closed over a stone the size of a satsuma. She waited until he was close, his animal grimace a jagged, toothy chasm that split his face in two. Then she lobbed the stone at him with every ounce of strength she had. It struck his nose with the sound that a milk bottle makes when it's dropped on a stone floor, and the man fell. Rilke bent down, looking for another missile, but it was too late. The teenage girl slammed into her, sending them both tumbling over the field. Cornstalks dug into her arms and legs. The wind punched from her as the girl's elbow hit her solar plexus. By the time she'd worked out which way was up, the girl was on her chest, knees gouging her ribs and claws raking down her cheeks. Rilke shrieked, the gargled sound that spilled from her own lips somehow more terrifying than the assault. There was no pain, just the roar of her blood. She lashed out, thumping her attacker in the cheek, then grabbing a handful of soil, rubbing it into the girl's eyes and forcing her back. Another howl. Rilke looked up in time to see some dreadlocked guy about to take a punt at her head. She rolled, the girl spilling from her, the man's foot swinging wide and sending him tumbling off balance. She scrambled to her feet, each breath a shriek. There were more people coming now, maybe 10. Sorry, way to break the dramatic tension. There were more people coming now, maybe 10 or 20 of them. "Schiller!" she yelled, ducking as another girl swung a punch. She kicked, her foot connecting with the girl's knee and unleashing a pistol crack. Where was he? There was only the crowd, tearing relentlessly forward. If she couldn't find him, then they were both dead. There, 15 metres or so away, a bundle of shadow that had too many arms and legs. It had to be him. Rilke ran, slipping on the loose soil and nearly going over. The tremors she felt beneath her feet were now nothing to do with the music that still played. She didn't look back, knowing that to do so would kill her. The only thing that mattered was reaching Schiller. She could hear him now, his brittle cries. He was lying on the ground, a man sitting on his stomach, choking him with fluorescent orange fingerless gloves. Schiller's eyes were the size of pickled eggs, looking like they were about to pop right out of his head, his own hands batting pathetically at his attacker. "Get off him!" Rilke screamed. She was a dozen yards away now, her fist bunched and held over her head, ready to cave the bastard's face in. Someone behind her clipped her foot, and she went flying, momentum flipping her body over in a clumsy somersault. A weight dropped on her back, and this time there was pain, a buckle of white heat that burned up her spine. A fist connected with the back of her head, pushing her face into the dirt. Then another, like a sledgehammer. She tried to breathe, but found only soil and worm stench. Somebody had hold of her right hand, bending it backwards. She was going to die. They were going to kill her, in this very field, a mile from where she lived. They would bury her here too, and nobody would ever find her. It was an impossible thought, too crazy to be real, too insane to believe. They're going to kill Schiller too. Those screams of his will be the last thing you ever hear. And that wasn't impossible. That wasn't crazy. That was all too real. They would kill her brother, stomp him into the ground. No, she wouldn't let them. They couldn't have him. Rilke wrenched her head up so hard she thought her neck would snap. She reached behind with her left hand, grabbing a fistful of flesh and squeezing hard. There was another grunt, this one laced with pain. The weight on her back shifted, not much but enough for her to worm her way forwards. Schiller was ahead, almost close enough to touch. There were 4 or 5 people over him now, each one different and yet each one wearing that same fury-filled expression. Their hands and feet rose and fell like pistons, like some horrific machine. But Schiller was still alive. She could see him through the gaps in the crowd, a hand held out towards her. If she could just reach him. What, you can die here holding hands? No, it was something more than that. Something else. A knuckled weight crunched down on her leg, another on her shoulder. She didn't stop, crawling forwards with everything she had. She reached for Schiller, and the distance between them, mere centimetres now, at the same time, a vast, abysmal chasm. "Schill!" She spoke his name through blood, but he heard her, turning his red, disbelieving eyes her way. Rilke! He stretched, his fingers crawling over the soil. She grasped for him, the gap shrinking from 5 centimetres to 4, to 3, to 2. Their fingertips touched, and the world burst into cold, dark fire. I didn't bring a drink with me today. How silly. Daisy, Fursville, 12:44 a.m. Did it work? Asked Cal. Did what work? Said Brick, standing here like a bunch of idiots holding hands. They were doing exactly that, huddled in a circle in the flickering light of the restaurant. Daisy wasn't sure why. She couldn't remember whose idea it had been. It had just happened. The same instinct that makes you flinch when someone throws a punch, that makes you seek shelter when you hear thunder. It worked, said Daisy, freeing herself from Brick's huge, clammy palm. Brick pulled his other hand out of Cal's, both boys wiping their hands on their clothes as though they had poison on them. Cal held on to her for a moment longer, giving her a gentle squeeze before letting go. How do you know? He asked. I just do, she replied. And she did. She'd seen it in her head, inside one of those little ice cubes. Although seen was the wrong word. She hadn't really seen anything, she'd just felt it. But what exactly had she felt? 2 people. Or maybe just one. They were so similar she couldn't be sure. They'd been scared. They'd been in pain. They'd been about to die. But then what? Daisy didn't know for sure, but she understood that the 3 of them, her, Cal and Brick, had helped. They'd done something. She could still sense the person, or the 2 people, the twins, she realised with a sharp intake of breath. Only there was something different about them, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. They were coming here, though. That much was clear. Daisy frowned, trying to remember more, trying to see inside those transparent, clinking movies that played inside her mind. There was something there that frightened her, something that burned, but she couldn't work out what it was. What now? Asked Brick. We light some joss sticks and sing Kumbaya? Daisy didn't reply. She just stared at the fire inside her head, trying to work out what was wrong, and why she felt so scared. Rilke, Farland, 12:45 a.m. Rilke's first thought was that she'd died. The thought that followed was that she couldn't have died because she was still thinking. Then came the realisation that she couldn't have died because she was in pain. She opened her eyes, the lids sticky as if she'd been asleep for a week. The stars were moving, spiralling across the infinite black canvas of the sky. Her ears were humming. Her whole body seemed to be locked tight with a muted, throbbing ache. Smoke clawed its way into her nose. It filled her head too, draping heavy shadows over her thoughts, her memories. Why was she here? Schiller, her brain told her, and at once her paralysis snapped free. She sat up, a jet of milk-white vomit erupting from her mouth without warning. She held her stomach with one hand, wiping spit away with the other. Stars drifted down from the night, landing on her face in the field beside her, glowing fiercely. She held out her hand, letting one settle on it. The spark guttered and then died. We knocked the stars from the sky, she thought. Our fingers touched and we knocked loose the stars. Only they weren't stars. How could they be? They were ashes like the flickering embers from a bonfire. They filled the air, dancing on their own heat. She looked through them, the world gradually coming into focus. Schiller was there, lying next to her. His face was a mosaic of bruises, blood running freely from his nose and his mouth. But he was alive. Seeing him like that brought everything back, and Rilke staggered to her feet, ready to defend herself from another attack. There was nobody there. Not only was nobody there, she didn't know exactly where there was. They were in a field, a different field. This one had something growing in it, a carpet of fat leaves painted silver by the moon. There was a glow against the horizon, and it took her a minute to understand that she was looking at the party, the rave. The distant crowd danced in the weak glow as if nothing had happened. She looked back at her brother, her brain desperately trying to put the pieces together, trying to make some kind of sense of what had just happened. "Shill," she asked, "are you okay?" He didn't reply, didn't show any sign that he'd heard her. Rilke crouched down beside him, pressing 2 fingers against his throat and feeling the pulse there, faint but steady. But he was cold. He was freezing. Touching him was like picking up a glass of ice water, and Rilke had to pull her hand away after a minute or so as the numbing chill crept into it. "Schiller," she said again, shaking the blood back down her arm. "Talk to me, please." He was in shock. He had to be. He'd taken a pretty bad beating, they both had, but how had they got from over there, getting the life stamped out of them by a bunch of stoned strangers, to right here? I fought them, her brain argued, picking strands of logic from the confusion. She looked down at her hands, stained pink like she'd been cutting up beetroot. I fought them and we ran, and it was so terrifying that I've already blocked it out. Right? That had to be it, didn't it? She wished she had a watch or a phone so that she could check the time. And so you can call an ambulance, right? No, she wasn't going to do that. There was no precise reason why not, only that she knew it would be the wrong thing to do. There was an image in her head, a picture, a memory that she had no actual memory of. A paramedic in his green overalls, his face somehow a horse's face as he threw himself at her, as he pushed her through a window. Somebody cried out from the direction of the party, a word she couldn't make any sense of. She tapped her pocket, feeling for the torch but not finding it. It was probably better this way. If they saw the light, then they might come after her again. They might be coming after her now, feet pounding through the darkness, fists clenched, that same depthless rage burning through their faces. The fury. "We need to go," she said, lifting one of her brother's arms and looping it around her shoulders. She braced herself, pushing up with her legs, his body ragdoll loose against hers. "Schiller," she snapped, his name seeming to echo against the night. "Pull it together. We need to get out of here." His head lolled against his chest, swinging from side to side like a nodding dog on a car's parcel shelf. She looked over her shoulder to the party, trying to get her bearings in the dark. If she was where she thought she was, then the road back into town was way off to her right. But that's not where she was headed. "Fursville," she whispered. The word ridiculous, meaningless, and yet the only thing she could think of. She caught a glimpse of a roller coaster, the wood rotting, a deserted restaurant. This was where she was supposed to go. And somehow she knew how to get there too, something inside her head pulling at her, leading her. "You're crazy," her head told her. "Go to the hospital, get Schiller some help. He'll die if you don't." Only she wasn't crazy. This was something else. The swarm of ashes had calmed, but they were still falling, darting like fireflies. She held out her free hand and caught another one, a fragment of charred pink leather that flickered and died in her palm. Another followed, this one a burning scrap of fluorescent orange. Like the man's gloves, those fingerless gloves around Schiller's throat, choking the life from him, which took flight again after a second or two, rising back into the night. Yeah, this was definitely something else. She hoisted Schiller up and started walking. He didn't give her any help, but she hauled him after her, step after step after step. The cold that was coming off him was unbelievable, like she was walking through the middle of a blizzard. This wasn't something a doctor could sling a bandage on or temper with antibiotics. Schiller didn't need a hospital. He needed whatever lay inside the place in her head, that abandoned theme park called Fursville. Right? She pushed the questions away, locking on to those instincts, to her absolute gut belief that what she was doing was okay. The sea wasn't far from here, and the little boatyard that belonged to the neighbouring village. She could hotwire one of the old roll-ups or dinghies. She'd done it before. It was a clear night, no wind. They could be there, wherever there was, before dawn. All she had to do was follow that feeling in her head, that guide rope tugging gently on her thoughts. Shivering, her teeth chattering so hard she was worried the ravers might hear them, Rilke kicked her way through the ash and the dirt, heading for the sea, heading for Fursville, heading for answers. Brick, Fursville, 5:59 a.m. Waking was easier this time, apart from the dull ache that sat in every muscle. Brick sat up, rubbing both hands through his hair and yawning so hard his jaw popped. Beads of light purled through the cracks in the boards over the windows, hanging on the dust and revealing Daisy on the sofa, Cal lying on the floor beside her, both still fast asleep. What had happened last night? They'd sensed something or someone. It had been Daisy's idea to try and send them a message, a mental picture of Fursville. It had seemed like a good idea in the dead of night, but daylight had a habit of bringing reality with it, common sense. Brick felt his cheeks burn at the thought of the three of them standing hand in hand in the middle of the restaurant, beaming psychic baloney out across time and space. He made his way towards the door, careful not to nudge any of the chairs or tables. He increased his speed once he was out in the corridor, hurrying past the peeling menus and special deal posters. Upgrade to a large haddock or cod for an extra 30p! And down the steps into the foyer. The light here was brighter, making his eyes sting, and he was almost glad to be back in the service corridor that led towards the fire exit, until he reached the basement steps. He stopped, his heart jackhammering in his throat. If Lisa was alive, of course she's alive. It's only been a day and she's got food and water, and just don't think about her injuries, Brick. Don't even think about them. Then this was about as close to her as he could get without her going nuts again, without her getting the fury. He cleared his throat. Then he called out her name. The word was a sigh, deafening to Brick, but too soft to carry. He looked right and left, trying not to think about what might have happened if she'd got out, if she was loose inside the building. He imagined her hands reaching from the shadows, those broken fingernails scraping down his face. Something moved behind the oil-black darkness at the bottom of the steps. A shuffling thump. Brick? Her faint voice almost knocked him to his knees. His eyes burned again, tears flowing before he even knew he was crying. Oh, thank God she's alive, she's okay. And he put his hand against the wall, hoping that somehow his touch might travel down into the basement, warm against her cheek. Please let me out. It sounded like she was speaking through a mouthful of toffee, but she seemed stronger than she had yesterday. Brick, it's not too late. It's okay, Lisa, he called back. There are more of us now. We'll think of something together, okay? Please, Brick, just let me out and we can talk about this. I'm not angry at you. I know, he said. I know you're not. I know you don't understand. I don't either, but what? But he'd find a way to fix it? Because you're a scientist, yeah? Because you're really clever? Because you can work all this out and then put that genius head of yours into gear and make everything better, right? He slapped his hand against his forehead, knocking the voice away. I will, he answered it. I will fix you, Lisa. I love you, he thought. The words were there, but his mouth didn't know how to shape them. I'll make it so things are like they were, he went on, those 3 unspoken words burning a hole in his throat. I swear I will. Just hang on, remember to drink. I'm right here. I won't leave you. There was another thump, a crash this time, and at first Brick thought Lisa was throwing herself at the door again. He took a step back, trying to get out of her radar or whatever it was that set off the fury. It was only when he heard it again, a pounding like fists on wood, that he realised it wasn't coming from the basement. It was coming from outside. It's the police. They've come for you. He moved down the corridor towards the fire exit and crept under the chains, his body on alert, ready to bolt at the first sign of a flashing blue light. He was fast. He could outrun them. Can you outrun their dogs too, the helicopters? But there were no sirens, no loudspeaker demands, no thunder of chopper blades. There was just that same rattling thump. Brick swallowed, realising that his head was filled with the same muted numbness as the previous night, that weird inverted silence. And with that realisation, the fear slothed away. Whatever was out there, it wasn't the police. He started across the overgrown path, walking past the crazy golf and the one-eyed giant squirrel, heading for the seaward side of the park. By the time he'd reached the storage sheds that ran along the back of the pavilion, he could hear a voice too. The sound of the sea disguised the words, but he was pretty sure it was a girl. Hello? He called out. Maybe he should just go back, wake the others. He could get the gun too, just in case. But despite his nagging worries, he didn't feel in any danger. He walked alongside the 9-foot-tall fence, bordered with the park's old ride signs and advertising hoardings. The one with Hook a Duck on it was rattling hard, and when he stopped beside it, the girl's voice was clear. Is anyone there? Let us in. Us, Brick thought, wondering again about the gun. Hello, he said. The pounding stopped, leaving the park eerily quiet. For some reason it was colder here too, like he was standing next to an open fridge. Who are you? We need help, the girl said. He could hear her shivering. My brother's hurt. The girl, whoever she was, hadn't gone rabid. She wasn't snarling at him through the fence. That had to be a good thing. There's a way in, he said. Go left, about 50 metres or so down. There's a break in the fence. I'll meet you there. He set off without waiting for a reply, jogging until he reached the engineering workshops. He ducked down the alley between them, moving the candy floss board and squeezing past the wire. The sun was just lifting up over the horizon, already dazzling, and he capped a hand to his forehead, peering through the shadow to see 2 people walking down the beach. The girl was a little younger than him, dark-haired and pretty, her face so pale it was blue. A mosaic of bruises and blood coloured her face and neck. She was almost carrying a boy, his arm around her shoulder, and as they got closer he saw that they had the same face. You maybe want to help?" she snapped. Brick grunted, trotting towards them. He was about a dozen yards away when the cold hit him, like he was running into a winter storm. Goosebumps broke out over his arms, and he could see his own breath, ghost-like in front of him. He stopped, wrapping his arms around himself. What the... Then he saw the dusting of ice that covered the boy's face, crystals hanging from his lips and his eyelashes. His skin was grey, and although his eyes were open, they had been frosted over. "Hurry up," said the girl. Brick started forward again, slower this time. His whole body was shuddering, the cold actually burning him. He manoeuvred himself around the side of the boy, ducking under his free arm and taking his weight. It felt as though he'd just buried himself in a snowdrift. The girl eased herself out, standing away and rubbing flecks of ice from the side of her face. "We need to get him inside," she said. "What's wrong with him?" Brick asked through his clacking teeth. The girl fixed him with a look as cold as her brother. "That's exactly what you need to tell me, because I want an explanation, and I want it now." Daisy. Fursville, 6:14 a.m. Daisy couldn't work out how the boy could be so cold and yet still be alive. Brick had carried him into the restaurant a few minutes ago, waking her. He'd shushed her off the sofa she'd spent the night on and laid the boy there, running off to find something to put over him. "It's going to be okay, Schiller," said the girl who'd walked in with him. She knelt beside the boy. She was wearing just a short skirt and a top. No wonder she looked so frozen. Her face was very pretty, other than the bruises, but there was something in it that made Daisy feel uneasy. It was probably just because she was a stranger. "I've found a couple more," said Cal, walking over with a handful of candles. He placed them on the coffee table beside the sofa, lighting them from one that was already burning and using the wax to stick them to the wood. The flames seemed reluctant, and Daisy didn't blame them. The air was so cold that even fire had to feel it. It would be easier to take the boards off the windows and let the sun in, but Brick had told them they couldn't do it in case people noticed and came snooping. "Who are you?" the girl asked. "You were attacked, right?" Cal said, "by complete strangers." The girl stared at Cal, and even though half a dozen candles burned, her eyes stayed dark. Daisy felt some of those strange, translucent ice cube images clinking in her brain. She tried to get a better look at them, but they bobbled just out of reach. "Right?" Cal said when she didn't reply. "And you saw our message online," added Brick as he staggered back into the room, peering over a mountain of linen. He dumped it all at the head of the sofa, and the girl began to sort through it, shaking out each tablecloth before layering them over the boy, tucking them under his motionless body. His cold had turned the damp inside the sofa to a sheen of ice which glittered like diamonds. Daisy blew out puffs of cotton wool breath, watching them dissolve into the air for the few minutes it took for the girl to finish. "Shill, can you hear me?" she said, getting to her feet and blowing on her blue fingers. The boy didn't respond, his glazed, frozen eyes staring at the ceiling. He was wrapped up tight, like a mummy. She put her hand to his forehead, then turned and glared at Brick as if this was somehow his fault. "Message?" she said after a moment. Brick looked at Cal, then at Daisy, and when nobody else spoke, he finally turned back to the girl. "We left a message online saying for people to come to Hemingway if they'd been attacked," he floundered, running his hands through his hair. "You didn't see it?" More clinking ice cubes in her head. Daisy saw a field and the heavens falling, burning flecks of stars. The boy was there, the girl too, and she could sense herself in the picture, her voice weird like she was listening to it on a badly tuned radio. "You heard us," she said. "Last night we told you to come here, and you did." The girl looked down at her, scowling. She took a deep, shuddering breath that appeared like a thought bubble. Daisy could almost read it. The emotions there packed tight, fear and anger, and a great deal of confusion. She felt sorry for her. "Look," said Cal, "the truth is, we don't know any more than you. I don't think so, anyway. Let's go outside, get some air, some sunlight. We can talk about it there, yeah?" They all shivered through another moment of awkward silence, and in it Daisy saw an ice cube vision float through her brain, the same one she'd seen last night, only now much clearer. This one was full of fire, so real that she felt like putting her hands to it, thawing them out on its heat. But there was something bad about it, something she didn't quite understand. The image shifted, melting, and Daisy thought she saw the park, Fursville, lost inside the flames, and the girl, too, in the centre of the inferno. Then the images split apart, fading into the guttering candlelight of the restaurant. "OK," said the girl. She tucked the tablecloths around her brother's neck and whispered something into his ear before looking at Cal. "Lead the way." Cal walked from the room, the girl following, then Brick. Daisy trotted after them, wondering if it was safe to leave the boy here, swaddled in cloth next to half a dozen candles. It wasn't that which was making her uneasy, though. The ice cubes had gone, but they'd left something unpleasant in her head, a feeling that she couldn't quite shake, even as she left the darkness of the restaurant and stepped into the brightness of the foyer. The new girl was dangerous. I better leave it there, actually, because I haven't done very well today, but we'll leave it there, because that's a nice little introduction to Rilke and Schiller, and we'll carry on tomorrow. But there we go, because I'm going to go and watch my middle daughter singing Christmas carols outside the library in town, which is always nice. Christmas, my favourite time of year, apart from Halloween. So I will shoot off and do that. But it was really lovely to see you. Thank you very much for joining me for the continuing saga of the Fury. It's getting really weird. I'd completely forgotten about the whole psychic stuff that seems to pass between the characters. And we'll see where that leads very soon. And we'll see if the new girl is dangerous. And who knows? Anyway, have a lovely day, whatever you're doing. I hope you have a brilliant time, full of cheer and joy and chocolate. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye.